Hi, how's it going? Hello everyone. I finally have another welder from Harbor Freight in the garage. I've looked at a lot of cheap stick welders, and today I'll be checking out the titanium Stick 225. It's definitely a little more expensive than some other stick welders I've tested, but one factor is that this welder is CSA certified, which surely adds some cost. This is a dual voltage welder that is rated at a max of 225 amps on 240 volts, and for me, the most disappointing spec is the 70 amps max output on 120 volts. I imagine the CSA certification is a factor in this limitation. Part of those types of standards is ensuring that the effective current draw of the welder doesn't exceed the rating of any components or the circuit it's connected to. The 120 volt adapter plug uses a standard 5-15P, which is designed for use with 15 amp circuits. This means that in order to pass certification with this plug, the welder likely was not allowed to have an effective draw over 15 amps when running on 120 volts. Effective draw being different than peak draw doesn't mean it won't draw more than 15 amps at times, but when factoring in the duty cycle, the effective draw should never be more than 15 amps with this type of circuit. They could have used a 20 amp style plug which has one horizontal terminal, but that style plug will only plug into 20 amp circuits. Many people don't have 20 amp circuits available, and in that case they simply wouldn't be able to plug the welder in. So Harbor Freight could have done like the Fronius or some other welders where they include swappable power cords and current limiting settings in the welder for different amperage circuits, but that would drive up cost. Power factor correction also allows greater output at a lower input current draw, but that again increases cost. There obviously could be other factors, but electrical safety rules stemming from CSA certification is probably at least part of the reason for the 70 amp output limitation on 120 volts. It has an 8-foot power cord and includes 10-foot cables, so you can get a reasonable distance from the receptacle without an extension cord. The cables are just 6 gauge, which is a bit thin for a 220 amp welder, but they are copper cables with decent insulation, so it's not all bad. The electrode holder is distinctly light duty, but the spring is pretty stiff and it does have copper alloy jaws. The work clamp is very cheap, but not the flimsiest I've seen, and it should work fine. Overall, the accessories are cheap but serviceable, and while the cables are thin, they are much better quality than some others. Strangely, this is one of the first welders I've seen in a long time that has a switch you have to flip to switch between the different input voltages. I'm not sure if anything would be damaged if you set the switch to the wrong voltage, and I'm not going to at least intentionally test that out just in case. Otherwise, it's a very simple welder. You have an analog amperage adjustment knob with multiple scales, one for 120 volts and one for 240 volts, and there is a designated range for 60-10 use on either voltage. I already mentioned the voltage selection switch on the front, and there's a power switch on the back. And that's it. Now let's pull the cover off and take a look inside.
All right, good chaps, let us dive into the build of this fine welder. Let's see where it takes us. Yes.
Okay. Now that I've got that out of my system. So I got the welder apart, and right off the bat, there were a couple minor disappointments. First of all, just that the screws that they use are, just a coarse thread, what look almost like a wood screw. You can see one here. Just, they almost look like a self-tapping wood screw. And sure enough, one of them was stripped and it was a little bit hard to get out. And there was no specific dedicated ground strap from the case or from the board or anything up to the outer case. But those weren't that big of issues. The screw thing, most people won't be taking it apart, and even if you are, I was able to get it apart. It wasn't that big of a deal. And as far as the grounds, they do use little star washers against the outer case to bite in through the paint to make sure that the outer case is grounded. So there are steps to make sure that the outer case is grounded. And all of the internal components where they all screw together, they made a point to leave bare spots in the paint so that there would be good connection and continuity through all the different parts of the case, and where the board bolts to the case so that that's all properly grounded. So overall, not too bad. Other than that, it seems to be built pretty pretty well. I do like the push-pull dual fan setup for cooling. That's not something I've seen before, and that's kind of neat. It has 4 220 volt rated capacitors, and there are bleed down resistors on the back of the board to bleed down those capacitors so that they won't stay charged up when the machine is off. It has a fairly substantial transformer here, big inductor, and overall the board is just put together pretty neat and tidy. There's silicone around some of the taller components and a few other little things done to kind of mitigate any kind of issues from vibration, which is nice. And not only are these boards quite a distance from the case on the back side, there's probably a good 1.5 inches between this divider partition and the outer case, so that if the outer case were to get knocked, it's not going to short out against the board, because he's got that, you have that 1.5 inches of distance, but also there's this center divider also in the way. So this machine is set up a lot better than some in terms of just protecting the boards inside from shorting out against anything if the outer case were to get banged and bent. Even the power wires, where they come in around the board, they have extra insulation wrapped around them to protect them where they come around components. Just any kind of contact point, they have that extra sleeving around them to protect them. So little touches in here that just kind of go to show that it's actually not built bad at all. It's obviously not as fancy as the inside of a Miller or a Fronius, but it's really not bad. It's definitely put together better than some of what I've seen. Oh, and just one final note, it also has copper straps to bring the output up to the front output connectors rather than aluminum that we see in some other machines, so that's also nice. But let's get it put back together and do some welding with it. Starting out on 120 volts, it does put out 70 amps. In fact, just over 70, as it bounces around from about 70 to 73. At that output, it draws around 29 amps from the wall. Not nearly as much as some cheap welders, but that's a result of maxing out at just 70 amps. And you'll surely have to limit the duty cycle to avoid tripping a 15 amp breaker. But even at just 70 amps on a thick block of steel, I had no problem starting a 3/32 7018. I was worried that since it was on the cold side, it would be a struggle to get started without sticking, but starts were smooth and very easy. Even on 120 volts, this is a really easy starting stick machine. When turned down to 60 amps, it put out just under 60. Not perfect, but not far off. When set at 45 amps, the output was spot on. On 240 volts, it actually maxes out at slightly over 225 amps. It will easily fire up and run a 3/16 7018 nice and hot. In all honesty, most people won't ever need 225 amps of output, but if you ever do, this machine will do it. Just keep the duty cycle in mind. Turned down to 120 amps, it once again easily and with no fuss starts 1/8 inch 7018 rods. I just have to comment again that this is a really easy starting and smooth running stick welder. And the output when set at 120 is pretty darn close to 120. At no point did I dial in an amperage and get anything other than what I would expect out of the setting. I adjusted the knob, shooting for 75 or so, fired up a 3/32 7018, it started easy and ran great, and it turned out I was getting exactly 75 amps. I turned it down a bit and struck up a 3/32 6013. Again, started easy and ran great. For everything other than 6010, this welder runs every bit as smooth as any cheap stick welder I've ever tested, and it starts better and easier than most. As for 6010, this welder does show a 6010 range on the dial, but it doesn't otherwise make a big point of being capable of running 6010. And yet, even on 120 volts, it will run 6010 as well as almost any welder I've ever tested.
Wow.
It starts a 6010 about as easy as any other rod, and it runs them confidently. No hesitation on the start, no stuttering at all, and I never had the arc go out on me once. Even when I was getting a bit wild with my arc length, 6010 just kept right on running.
That is fantastic.
This welder is exciting. It's exciting because it does what it says, and it does it in a way that doesn't feel like a compromise. Sure, there are compromises for the price. The build doesn't have a premium feel, the included accessories are a bit cheap, though the cables are much nicer than the aluminum cables that come with many cheap welders, but it lacks power factor correction, the output on 120 volts is limited, there's no fan on demand, the warranty is a bit short if you don't pay extra for an extended warranty, and it doesn't have things like adjustable hot start and arc force. So it isn't as if there's nothing to gain by spending more. But this machine doesn't feel like a cheap welder in use. The way it starts and runs rods just feels good, and the output is accurate and consistent. I could select an amperage for a given rod and be confident that I would get the expected result. I'm just sorry that the low output on 120 volts kept me from testing it sooner. It would still be nice if it had a bit higher output on 120 volts, but the 70 amp output doesn't feel like as big of a limitation as I expected, because it otherwise runs just as well on 120 volts as it does on 240. Based on my use so far, I would say that this is probably the best cheap stick welder I've tested. I didn't get the oscilloscope out for this one, but I may do another video with this machine at some point if people are interested in seeing some more testing. In the meantime, if you have any questions, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care.